Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well, guys. Welcome to my non-room. You might be happy to hear that in less than a week, in fact in 5 days or so, I'll be back in my room. The historical room, the room that you are familiar with, at least for those who have been following this channel for a little while now. So my return to France is planned for Sunday. My dad will be picking me up at the airport because he's a very nice man, and eventually will be dropping me at my mum's place because my parents are not together, despite the fact they get on, as can be seen in the video I made with them. And from the moment that I'm back home, I have access to my actual room again. But this is not the topic that I want to discuss today. I would like to offer some musings on this question of seeking validation from other people through the lens of philosophy, psychology, and maybe a little bit of a drop of the model based on Jung's work that we like. As INFJs, we're people who have an interesting kind of relationship with this seeking for validation, I think. Now, of course, you could say that in general terms, everybody is more or less likely to seek for validation across their lives. It's almost like a function of social interactions. Perhaps it is almost a function of having empathy in a way, because if having empathy is sort of feeling what the other person is feeling in very, very broad terms. Frank James made a video on the topic that is much more profound than the definition I just gave. But if empathy involves this thing, in a sense, we are able to see that other people exert judgments, and in the way that we exert judgments. I do not think that everyone I know is great at this particular thing or that particular thing. I have friends who are amazing musicians. I have friends who I think are, and usually they know that they're not as amazing musicians. They're like music, and maybe they're better at other things, most likely. So obviously our judgments are varied and they do not apply universally across the board. And so I think by the fact that we can empathize, formally speaking, about other people thinking the way that we do, in a way, like our seeking for validation also is originarily connected to the fact that we, by our judgments, give a kind of validation of our thoughts to certain people for certain things. I think the difference between people is that, as you can see, I just spent about 3 minutes entering into an almost phenomenological analysis of something that probably would pass people by, a lot of people by. Maybe most of them would be what we call sensors, because people of the sensing type do not tend to dwell on the analysis of these things that much, taking things as they come, at least more often than not. Intuitive types are a bit more likely to ask themselves the question. So maybe this creates an additional difficulty or weight, existential weight on intuitive types, because in addition to seeking validation from other people, in a certain sense in which anyone who is not a psychopath or a sociopath would, to some extent, and perhaps there's a healthy dose, of seeking validation. I'm not sure that seeking validation from other people is necessarily a bad thing. Some tremendous things have been achieved by athletes, by writers, by who happen to be geniuses in their own domain, whether in the physical, athletic domain or in more artistic or intellectual domains, wanting to surpass someone that they admired. There is seeking for validation in that particular respect. So I don't think seeking for validation is necessarily a bad thing. Of course, it could be carried to extremes, in which case one loses their authenticity, and that becomes a big problem. But in any case, intuitive types may be a little bit more likely to suffer more from this need for validation, not only because they simply feel it and therefore sometimes must make certain efforts to meet it or to hope to meet that validation, or in addition, rather, intuitive types are probably a bit more likely to spend time pondering the reasons why, the mechanics, and maybe sometimes be led to regret that this need exists, but not quite be able to resolve it, or perhaps making it worse by overthinking. It's usually true that thinking something away does not resolve the thing at the emotional level. So that's, maybe that's something that is going to be the bane of some people. I know that as far as I'm concerned, there is a history, I think, as far as I'm concerned, of my need for validation from other people. There's a history. So it begins in my early years. I'm sure I was dying to get a lot of validation from my parents when I was very young. I don't remember that in detail, but if I'm even just to focus on the years, from my early 20s onwards, or rather from my late teens onwards, there was definitely various sort of oscillations of the intensity of my need for being validated by different people. There are some people whose validation I feel like I've always kind of needed. My parents probably would be important in that list, but not only, of course, to some extent maybe everyone that I know, again at varying degrees and through varying nuances and differing contexts. I would say that I've arrived at a point where I feel like I've struck a reasonable balance, I do not want to behave as if I were ignoring the sort of need for validation that you get from other people, because I find that if you do that, you think that you're independent and autonomous, you think that you're like an INTJ or something. And thereby, paradoxically, you confirm that you are actually kind of obsessed with this question because you're so intent on trying to suppress it, suppress this so human, so social, so empathic need in many ways. So the question is perhaps not so much how to get rid of this need, maybe the question is more how to make sure that this need is healthy, that it consists in caring about the image that one has with other people, with regards to deeper questions, such as does that, am I perceived as someone who's pleasant to be with, who's respectful, someone who is whose presence is enhancing? Am I perceived as someone who is authentic, someone who's passionate, someone who is, all these things. I think that if you look at the question of the need for validation from that lens, it becomes quickly clear that there's no issue with having this need. It's a totally other issue if people start being concerned with, I think, more superficial questions, regarding what they want to be validated about. Say like with a particular isolated achievement or a trait of their personality. If they're very eager to be perceived as intelligent or be perceived as this or that, in such a way that it would enhance their reputation. I think there's a very big difference between seeking validation that's reputational, whereas seeking validation that is more existential, something more profound, something that informs the very way that we are as human beings and how we can better ourselves as human beings. And so it's true that maybe as an intuitive type, And maybe as an intuitive feeling type, such as the INFJ type is, these musings can happen as they are happening to me right now, quite in a quite unprepared fashion. You know, I'm more or less improvising here, although I had in mind this topic because, you know, in life I keep running into people who really seem to be desperate for this validation, people who seem to build their sense of identity around either what people think of them, or rather more often what they think that people think of them. And they're just tremendously, people in general really seem to tremendously care about this. And what was floating around my mind was to ask the question, to what extent is this normal and is this okay, and to what extent is it not? And initially I was tempted to opt for the hardline, you know, sort of approach, saying the need for self-validation or for validation of oneself is always wrong. It's like a human fallibility. It's not something to necessarily regret, because we are finite, we're humans, we have our feelings, we have our histories and temperaments, and so we're always going to have to fight against it, but the less need for validation that we have, the better. So I'd catch myself at certain points thinking that, but I'm not sure this is true. I think that fundamentally, if it is part of who we are to seek for that validation to some extent and in some way, then we should accept that this happens, whilst having an awareness that allows us to not so much keep it in check, but just make sure that it is healthy and directed toward the right questions and the right orientation at what to be validated about. Like I said, if it is about one's moral qualities, and if it is from the point of view of trying to genuinely improve oneself, morally, behaviorally, or, you know, even intellectually, rather than just taking care to preserve one's reputation, I think it's perfectly fine. And I think an INFJ, to just try to focus the discussion now a little bit more on the question of INFJs, again, feeler type, not only feeler type, but extroverted feeler type. Therefore, INFJs have, by definition, a quite extroverted, a projectedness into the system of beliefs, norms, opinions of the social realm. It's not something that they take into themselves and analyze as something that they make sense of once it is always being interacted with other people, which means that they're always going to be, and that's the same with ISFJs, ESFJs, ENFJs, etc. It's always going to be something that INFJs are quite aware of. It's going to be hard for an INFJ to be. An INFJ who's healthy is probably going to always have this awareness of not just the vibe in the room, but what people think, including what people think of them, and this accompanying desire for validation, which it's a very complex thing. You know, it's not only healthy from the point of view of self-enhancement, it's also just an existential correlate of the need to belong with other people, which is connected to the INFJ type in a very acute way, and I won't go into it in detail here. But I would say what's really interesting about INFJ is that this need for validation, among other things, is channeled via FE and made quite potent. It's they're very acutely aware of it. But we are also very sharply insightful about it via introverted intuition, via our dominant function. It means that we are both very aware of it, but also very in touch with it and able to be analytical about it. So it's almost going to be this tug of war. And tug of war is an expression that I use a lot in the case of INFJs, because I do believe, and I still maintain, that INFJs are among the other types, really one of the types that like concentrates a lot of so-called paradoxes, you know, feeler, thinker, and also perhaps craving for independence, whilst always having to accept that this fighting or this carving out of one's independence is always going to be taking place within a larger background of using others as a sounding board to figure out whether things are working out on that front. I think more so than it would be the case for introverted feelers, including introverted feeler in their tertiary function, and maybe even more so. But so feeler type, extroverted feeler type, intuitive type, so likely to constitutively seek some validation for the way that they comport themselves or the way that they choose to direct their lives, to behave in any context. INFJs are simultaneously maybe the most capable of analyzing where that need comes from and how to apprehend it best, and maybe how to make their insights available to people who maybe from other types, other shades of behavior that could be captured as types, would maybe not think so much about, and at the same time engage in it in even more egregious way when it comes to the superficial aspect of seeking validation. So it's almost like the INFJ type is placed ideally because they experience this need, and they can also intuitively and thinkingly analyze this need and be able to come up with a sort of picture of what would be good for self-validation and where it turns into something that is not good, is counterproductive, is purely reputational, superficial, and defeats the INFJ's long-term purpose and craving for independence. So that's some very preliminary musings on the question of looking for validation, opinions of others, having to live with it, analyzing it, where to set the limits, what are the healthy bounds for it. But let me know in the comments what you think, what is it your experience, and I'll be talking to you very soon. See you guys. Ciao.